propaganda is the most valuable tool that Russian President Vladimir Putin uses to keep his country under control. Beyond the army that he sent to Ukraine, the Kremlin employs a much different army of mouthpieces and writers who fill Russia's state-owned television shows, radio broadcasts and newspapers with claims of Russian superiority. Typically absent are reports on what Ukraine has achieved. That's all part of the Putin plan. But what happens to that plan when the Kremlin narrative doesn't align with what the people it hires to talk it up are saying? Putin is about to find out, as he's been betrayed by his own propagandist who admits that Ukraine will never fall. That propagandist is Vladimir Solovyov, who's long been one of Putin's most vocal allies. Most every night, Solovyov takes to Russian state television to go on rants about how Ukraine is on the verge of collapse and that it will only be a matter of time before Russia achieves a magnificent victory. At least, that's what Solovyov does. However, October 13 was a very different day for the Kremlin's propaganda machine and one of Putin's favorite mouthpieces. This time, Solovyov didn't rant about the brilliance of Russia or the superiority of Putin's tactics. He was quieter, more somber than usual, and, as Euromaidan press reports, Solovyov was visibly shaken as he delivered words that Putin were never expected to hear out of one of his favorite puppets. "We underestimated what's happening. We thought NATO just sent finished products, but now the military-industrial complex is outside Ukraine," Solovyov said on his show. "Our strikes aren't decisive. Foreigners are actively joining Ukraine's ranks. There should be no illusions." That small quote is precisely what it sounds like. One of Putin's best propagandists is admitting that Ukraine is doing far better than he's claimed it's doing. And worse yet for Putin, the Russian military seems to have no answer. There are a couple of interesting things to note here. First, though he admits that Russia has made major miscalculations in the Ukraine war, Solovyov at least still attempts to pander to the Kremlin narrative. His claims that NATO is solely responsible for Ukraine having defended itself for so long aren't accurate. Yet the help Ukraine receives from its allies is vital, and it's played a huge part in the Ukraine war. But Solovyov is admitting, purposefully or otherwise, the fact that Ukraine has gotten stronger as a military nation, even without help from its NATO allies. That point will be explored later in the video. The second interesting thing here is that this isn't the first time that Solovyov has been critical of Russia's military. As far back as February 2023, a year into the war that Putin thought would be done and dusted in about a week, Solovyov ranted about the state of the Russian military. "Are we going to fight? If we are, using what or whom?" Solovyov declared on his TV program. "If we're waging the campaign seriously and we understand that the special military operation finished a long time ago and that we're now fighting NATO, then maybe we now need to implement something." He went on to claim that Russia was pushing 100 meters forward and 100 meters back, before stating that the 300,000 conscripted soldiers of the time were wearing down and needed to be rotated. So, Solovyov is no stranger to taking little nibbles at the hand that feeds him. However, October 13 was different. Back in 2023, one could almost see his rant as a sort of call to action for Russia. Solovyov wasn't claiming that Russia was going to lose. He was just pointing out a problem and calling for a solution. Russia could and should win, even if Ukraine had allies who will deliver everything to them. Solovyov even coloured this 2023 rant with claims that Russia needs to go after the Western countries supplying Ukraine with weapons, even as he said that Russia's military was exhausted. It's easy to imagine these words coming out of Putin's mouth. Yet another criticism of NATO, and with the 100 meters forward and 100 meters back comment, almost an admonishment of Russia's military for not being as capable as their authoritarian leader expected them to be. The October 13 comments, on the other hand, were delivered with an almost resigned tone. Gone were the hellfire and brimstone that often accompany Solovyov's rants, replaced by a straightforward statement that Ukraine is much stronger than Russia expected, and that Russia has underestimated the true threat that it faces on the Ukraine battlefield. Are these the sorts of words that Putin would be happy to hear? It seems unlikely. Solovyov may have just gone off script to deliver a damning indictment of Putin's failures, Ukraine's strength, and the war that's lasted almost 4 years when it was supposed to be over in about a week. This alone would be bad enough for the Kremlin. seeing one of its top propagandists betray the narrative on a TV show that is on Russia's most popular federal channel, and has even received an award for being the country's best socio-political show, is bad enough. However, it gets worse for the Kremlin, as Solovyov is far from the only propagandist who is starting to speak out against the Ukraine war. There are others, and they're getting louder. In a September 2022 interview, another Kremlin mouthpiece, Tatiana Montian, said that Russia is severely lacking the manpower that it needs to win the Ukraine war, and that Russia would be forced into another wave of mobilization if the spring-autumn campaign fails to gain the ground that Putin expected. In the first half of September, the pace of the offensive slowed significantly. They may have committed their last reserves, Montian said. The second half of September ended up being no better than the first, leading to the Russian advance slowing by nearly half of its previous pace by the end of the month. CNN reports that Russia occupied 44% less Ukrainian territory in September than it did in August, with August also being the end of Russia's much vaunted and ultimately failed summer offensive. Another Russian propagandist, Pavel Gubarev, has delivered an even fiercer indictment of Russia's situation in Ukraine. Once Putin's proxy leader in the Donetsk region, Gubarev said that Russia was suffering from incomparably heavy losses, before adding, "In reality, the current situation is already tantamount to defeat for us. Russia does not have the capability to complete the special military operation with the achievement of set goals and victory under the colonial system of the current government." As it stands, it would take Russia 108 years to fully occupy Ukraine, per Pravda reporting on statistics published by The Economist. Putin doesn't have that much time. Russia doesn't have enough people. And Putin's propagandists are starting to wake up to that fact. The Kremlin's propaganda machine is starting to break down, as explored in another video. Check that video out to learn more about what's happening with the voices Putin relies on to keep Russia's people under control. For now, back to Solovyov's comments. The Kremlin propagandist towed the narrative line by laying all of the blame for Ukraine's stellar defense against Russia at NATO's feet. However, NATO weapons alone aren't the reason why Russia has spent nearly 4 years fighting Ukraine, only for no signs of the outright collapse Solovyov and his ilk have been predicting for years. There's something much deeper going on that Solovyov likely knows but is too afraid to say on state-owned Russian television. It's not just NATO, it's Ukraine. Specifically, Ukraine has somehow been growing stronger as a military nation throughout the Ukraine war, to the point where it's harder for Russia to win now than it might have been 2 or 3 years ago. And the first sign of this growing strength is the immense militarization of Ukraine. According to the George W. Bush Institute, Ukraine's standing army was only about 130,000 members strong when Putin first annexed Crimea. Even worse than that, the Institute claims only 6,000 of those soldiers were combat ready at the time of Russia's initial acts of aggression. Undersupply was also a problem, which is why Ukraine had to practically beg the US for things like blankets and military rations. The Institute adds that Ukraine's former chief of the general staff, Viktor Muzenko, claimed that about 75% of Ukraine's military equipment was over 2 decades old and likely obsolete in 2014. Only 12 of Ukraine's 800 tanks were usable, and just about 15% of Ukraine's combat aircraft were ready to fly. Between 2014 and 2022, Ukraine strengthened dramatically, and Russia didn't seem to notice. Putin's arrogant belief that his forces would steamroll through Ukraine seems to have been based on the state of Ukraine's military during the initial 2014 acts of aggression. When Ukraine pushed back against Russia's initial invasion, it did so with territorial fighters and a sense of purpose that didn't exist back in 2014. Ukraine was stronger in 2022 than it was when Russia annexed Crimea, and now Ukraine is more militarized than ever before. The Atlantic Council reports that Ukraine has about 1 million active service members who are defending it against Russia. That makes Ukraine's military 4 times larger than the next European military outside of Russia. And that sheer size is now combined with combat hardening and, yes, the modern weapons that Ukraine's allies have provided. Ukraine's growing military strength is often an underrated factor, the Council said in March. Solovyov seems to have realized this with his statements about how Russia underestimated Ukraine. However, Ukraine's strength and massive militarization aren't limited to the size of its army or the contributions made by the West. Ukraine is stronger across the board as a military nation that's drawing closer to self-sufficiency than it would ever have become were it not for Putin. On the weapons production front, Ukraine is certainly much stronger than it has been at any point during its history as an independent country. As Euromaidan press reports, the period between January and July of 2025 saw Ukraine's Ministry of Defense increase its domestic weapons procurement by around $4.2 billion compared to the same period in 2024. Now, the country is projecting that it will spend about $35 billion on domestic missile and drone production alone in 2026. Keep Ukraine's drones in mind. They'll be revisited later in the video. The growth of Ukraine's domestic defense industry during the war with Russia has been staggering. Even as Russia bombards Ukraine weekly with aerial strikes, in addition to everything that Russia is doing on the ground, the growth has been explosive. At the beginning of the invasion, Ukraine made around 10% of its own weapons. 2 years later, the number was at 35%, and it had reached 40% by the middle of 2025, according to Vladimir Zelensky. Ukraine believes that the only way is further up in this aspect of its militarization. Back in July, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had bigger plans for the future. We're transforming the management of the defense sector and weapons production so that within 6 months, the share of Ukrainian-made weapons available to our warriors will noticeably increase, Ukraine's president proclaimed in a speech to the country's parliament. Currently, about 40% of the weapons in the hands of our warriors are made in Ukraine. In 6 months, it should be no less than 50%. So, it looks like Ukraine is not only ahead of schedule, but has surpassed even this ambitious goal. By September, The Guardian was reporting that around 60% of the weapons that Ukraine soldiers use are now built in Ukraine. Zelensky has provided that figure, adding that many of the weapons Ukraine is producing are more advanced than anything the country has built before. And that may be the point that Solovyov is either missing or purposefully omitting. As important as Ukraine's Western allies have been when it comes to direct weapons procurement, Ukraine itself hasn't been idle on the defense manufacturing front. It's been learning, adapting, and most importantly, investing in its own defense industry. Whether the advanced weapons Ukraine is building are inspired by the Western arms it's received is immaterial at this point. The fact is that Ukraine's weapons manufacturing base is incredibly strong, and it's only getting stronger. That's something Russia never expected. And along with the massive growth of Ukraine's standing army, it's another factor that plays into Solovyov's claim that there should be no illusions about Ukraine's capabilities. He's warning the Russian people that Ukraine is far stronger than the Kremlin's propaganda has shown them, and the growth of the country's defense sector is only making it stronger. Ukraine isn't self-sufficient yet, but it's getting closer. There is one thing that Solovyov is bang on the money with: Ukraine's expanding international facilities. Though Ukraine is trying to centralize as much of its weapons production as possible, it also realizes that its international partners are vital to its continued success. After all, if Russia is able to locate and bomb Ukraine's weapons manufacturing facilities, all of the country's hard work goes out the window. Euromaidan press notes that Ukraine currently builds 80% of its own drones, with the rest coming from joint projects with partners such as Denmark and Poland. On the missile front, these joint projects account for roughly 1/5 of Ukraine's missile building. Poland is also part of a Europe-wide partnership named the Czech Initiative, which has coordinated the delivery of millions of artillery shells to Ukraine through a broad coalition of donor nations. Ukraine has been very clever in the sense that it's built an entire network of manufacturing that is difficult for Russia to break. By incorporating its international partners into that network, Ukraine also protects itself. Another example comes from the production of the ADMITS drone. Though the drone itself appears to be based on a Ukrainian design, the software and computerized systems that drive the drone are made by a US-based company named Auterion. Watch our video to discover more about the insane drone that Ukraine and its American partner have produced. Again, Ukraine is spreading its wings by bringing other nations into its weapons manufacturing fold. And this is weapons manufacturing, not weapons procurement or weapons donations. Solovyov is accurate when he says that NATO-aligned nations are helping with all of this, but he discounts the role that Ukraine itself is playing. These sorts of manufacturing initiatives are full-on partnerships between Ukraine and its allies, and they benefit all involved. Add to that more procurement-focused initiatives, such as the US-led Pearl initiative, through which Ukraine can purchase the weapons it needs from the US with military aid received from its European allies. And that results in the sort of collaboration that Solovyov decries. Only, it's a collaboration on a far deeper level than even the beleaguered propagandist realizes. This is quid pro quo. Ukraine's allies make it stronger, and Ukraine makes its allies stronger. For Russia, the result is a larger and better equipped Ukrainian army than Putin anticipated. That army uses weapons made in Ukraine that would never have been built were it not for the invasion. And the partnerships Ukraine has now are stronger than they would have been otherwise. Perhaps this is Solovyov's point, though he doesn't outright say it. Putin overplayed his hand for too long, and now he's created a monster that Russia can't kill. As if things couldn't get any worse for Russia, it's not just that Ukraine is bigger and better than it was when Russia invaded, it's also smart. Much smarter than Putin believed, as Ukraine has demonstrated many times that it's able to adapt its tactics and focus its resources on the types of weapons that cause Russia the most problems. Right now, two types of weapons are turning Ukraine from an already powerful force into one that's capable of doing even more damage to Russia than seen already: long-range precision weapons and drones. On the long-range front, it's no secret that Ukraine has been targeting as many military and military-adjacent facilities inside Russia as it can. Oil refineries have been its main target in 2025, and a slew of strikes throughout August, September and October have seen Ukraine cripple nearly 40% of Russia's oil refining. The strikes have led to fuel shortages throughout Russia, which places pressure on Putin and forces Russia to rely on importing a product that it would have otherwise made itself. Ukraine knows exactly what it's doing with these strikes. It's chipping away at the Russian war machine, with each strike weakening Putin's forces on the ground in Ukraine. To support this death by 1,000 cuts strategy, Ukraine is building more precise long-range weapons in greater quantities than ever before. The Neptune and Flamingo weapons, in particular, are seeing Ukraine build hybrid cruise missiles that are incredibly accurate and pack a far greater punch than the drones the country has been using in its long-range strikes up to this point. Flamingo, which is a 1,860-mile range that puts even Moscow at risk, has entered mass production and will soon be wreaking havoc on targets all over Russia. Again, the point always stands. None of this would have happened if Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine. And then there are Ukraine's drones. Earlier examples have shown how effective these drones have been when it comes to Ukraine's long-range strikes. But they've been a revolution on the battlefield. Ukraine has built a literal drone army that's capable of taking out almost any equipment that Russia has. Tanks have proven especially vulnerable to a cheap drone's ability to get in close and launch kamikaze attacks. However, Ukraine has been using drones to destroy other armor, air defense radars, and troop deployments too. What Putin believed would be a relatively short war of attrition that would see Russia's superior manpower and equipment numbers win out in the end has transformed into drone-focused combat. Ukraine now has the capacity to build between 8 and 10 million drones per year, assuming it's able to get its hands on the funding that will allow its drone manufacturers to reach their potential, the Jamestown Foundation reports. As for drone effectiveness, Ukraine's unmanned vehicles are now responsible for up to 80% of all of Russia's casualties in the Ukraine war. It may soon be more, especially now that Ukraine is working with its Western partners to create smarter drones, such as the ADMITS mentioned earlier. This is the reality of the Ukraine war that propagandists like Solovyov are only now starting to report. Yes, Solovyov's betrayal of the Kremlin narrative still lays all of the blame at NATO, but he knows, as do Russia's other propagandists, that Russia itself has turned Ukraine into a far more militarized nation. Ukraine may never fall, and if it does, that fall will take a huge toll on Russia to the point where a country that was once one of the world's leading military superpowers will be left as a lame duck just waiting for a more powerful nation to put it out of its misery. And Russia may have to wait less time than it thinks for that to happen. At this very moment, Russia's Far East is increasingly falling into Chinese and North Korean hands. There's nothing that Putin can do to stop it either, as you'll discover if you check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of how the Kremlin's narrative is crumbling under Putin.